Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this panel on the sustainability revolution in trade agreements. My name is Pierre-Hugues. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia School of Law. I'll be the moderator for this great panel today. So I'll give a few words of introduction and then we'll go on to introduce the participants. So historically, trade agreements have primarily, as you know, have had a liberalization purpose. They've been oriented around the objective of reducing barriers to trade and promoting economic exchange. And to do so, what they typically do is limit the ability of states to adopt domestic policies that impact or restrict trade in various ways, including the types of regulations that we now see as promoting various types of sustainability, such as environmental regulations, labor standards, and other types of domestic regulatory regimes that pursue these objectives. So in that paradigm, in what one might call the traditional paradigm, the way that sustainability considerations could be accommodated within the system was at best as exceptions, by shaping exceptions within the system so that they would allow, at least in certain circumstances, states to pursue sustainability-oriented policies in ways that do not unduly impinge on the objectives of trade liberalization. But since the 1990s, or at least that's the contention of the project that we are going to be examining, there is a contrary and growing trend for trade agreements to incorporate various positive obligations in areas like labor standards, environmental regulation, and related sustainability-linked areas of regulation, which raises many questions. Are these new kinds of provisions effective in incentivizing countries to improve standards in these areas? Do they affect, or how do they affect different countries and different constituencies differently? So how do they interact with other kind of distributive conflicts that exist in the international trade and economic system? And a bigger question yet is the introduction of these kinds of positive obligations changing the way we think about international economic law by introducing central objectives or objectives of agreements that are other than traditional trade liberalization, but introduce these sustainability as a goal of the system, perhaps in ways that could influence how we read and interpret other obligations that existed for a long time. So our first panelist, Professor Kathleen Claussen from Georgetown University, and Geraldo Vidigal, who is not here from Amsterdam Law School, who is not here today, unfortunately, but has been participating in this project, have been putting together a book that will be the first book that examines these issues comprehensively. And here I'm quoting from the summary of the book. The first book that, quote, examines the legal, political, and economic effects of the incorporation of sustainability provisions as standard elements of trade agreements, recent advances surrounding such provisions, and a future outlook for trade agreements as sustainability tools. So on that note, I will turn it over to the panel, who's composed of four distinguished scholars who are all contributors to this ongoing book project. The first, of course, is Professor Claussen, who is one of the co-editors. We also have, in order from I guess, right to left, Yuka Fukunaga from Waseda University, Laurent Bartels from the University of Cambridge, and James Nedumpara from the Center for Trade and Investment Law. And they will, each of them, tell us about some of the perspectives they're bringing to this project through their respective chapters. And I'll try to moderate this by asking the participants some questions in order to get the discussion started. And I'll start with Professor Claussen. Now, the contention of your book project, or the foundation of your book project, is that there is some sort of revolution underway, that there is a sort of fundamental transformation of the international trading system that is reflected or perhaps brought about by the introduction of these sustainability objectives. Of course, not everyone, including not everyone amongst the contributors to the book, agrees with this perspective or think that it is particularly salient now as opposed to other times in the past. Professor Claussen, could you give us some examples of this sustainability revolution that you identify and how and where you're seeing it in the world?
Great. Thanks so much, Pierre. So thanks everybody for being here. It's great to see a packed room for the topic, and Geraldo really wishes he could have been here. He's on a plane now, delayed one day, but he'll be here this evening. So he and I were honored that SIEL would choose this topic for a panel to reflect the good work of the book. And in his stead, we're very grateful to Pierre for jumping in to moderate, and then to Lauren, who was able to join us as well on the panel in Geraldo's absence. So I'm going to say a little bit about the book just because we're very excited about this book, and it's been such a pleasure to read the contributions as each of our authors have been sending them in. The book is due to come out later this year with OUP. So if you're a contributor to the book, could you just raise your hand? Is there a bunch of you in the room? Yeah, great. Thank you. Everybody here and a few out there. And then there are others at the conference who aren't in this room. But it's an all-star lineup. It really is. It's an embarrassment of riches. And each of the chapters takes on an important aspect of this question. And I want to go back to what Pierre said a moment ago, the sort of sustainability revolution, and the sort of R is in parentheses in a way, because is it an evolution? Is it a revolution? It's a question for us. We're not really sure. And so we wanted to put the book together to get a sense of what is happening in trade agreements, more than just Geraldo and I know sitting around in our respective institutions. What should we be paying attention to? Does it matter? If so, why does it matter? And which constituencies and groups may be affected in different ways? So those are sort of underlying questions motivating the big question that is the book project. And it's our privilege really to edit it. So let me tell you just a bit about the sections of the book, and then what we're going to focus on, the four of us here. First, one section of the book is really about concepts and whether we have the right sort of concepts surrounding sustainability in trade agreements. And then the next section gets into the nuts and bolts. And so we have three different groups of contributions in the nuts and bolts section. One deals with labor standards, another with gender rights and disability, and another with indigenous peoples. That's the sort of social sustainability group. Then we've got the environmental section. So we've got multilateral environmental agreements, self-standing obligations, and climate action in FTAs. And then our third sort of set of concrete chapters deal with enforcing sustainability obligations. And so different contributions on adjudication, cooperative enforcement mechanisms, and outsourcing enforcement mechanisms, all of which are sort of in our sustainability space. We're seeing a great deal of innovation. And then the final part of the book is more sort of conceptual analysis, looking to the future. What will sustainability look like through our trade agreements in the next 50 years? And so again, a lot of great work there. The book tries to really disaggregate among the norm creation, the institutions, and the enforcement. And so inevitably that means it also borrows from well-developed other areas of law, something I mentioned this morning as well, the sort of more interdisciplinary conversations that the book tries to have is entirely necessary when we're going to talk about sustainability here. So it's not just unpacking ideas that we see in different provisions of trade agreements, but actually unpacking the idea of sustainability, unpacking the idea of sustainable development. Are those the same? How do they interact? Breaking all of that out is part of the project. So labor is the low-hanging fruit of the story. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by talking about some of the social sustainability commitments in trade agreements, and particularly labor, and then pass off, and then Pierre will direct questions to the others on these other sorts of topics that I've mentioned that appear in the book. But why start with labor? Well, as I mentioned, I really think it is the low-hanging fruit in our social sustainability conversation, because firstly, well, now it's heavily ingrained in our trade agreements that you all know that well, right? And we're not just talking about G7 economies, we're talking beyond G7 economies that are thinking about labor standards in trade agreements for different reasons. And so it makes sense to start there. And also because the questions of labor also speak to popular support for trade agreements, right? And especially in the United States, we would not have popular support for trade agreements without having labor provisions in there. So those are the two obvious reasons to me why it makes sense to start with labor. And indeed, I think the US has the lead on this for a long time. We first had labor in the side agreements to the North American Free Trade Agreement, the NALC as it was called, the North American Agreement on Labor Cooperation. And that from there forward, the United States has continued to introduce and strengthen labor provisions across its now 16 different trade agreements. Now, I tend to describe the labor story as having been punctuated, so to speak, by certain critical junctures, certain milestones in that story. And let me talk about three. One in 2007, one in 2017, and one in 2019, most recently. So these are the moments that I think have most shaped the practice of labor provisions in the US, but then with a sort of ancillary effect, ripple effect on other governments and their approaches to labor standards. So the book, I would say, just does not look at a narrow time horizon, and when we talk about what the revolution means. But so I think for each sort of topic that we deal with, it's a slightly different horizon, and that's why we don't bound ourselves that way. But for labor, the way that at least I think about it is looking at the last 15 years, and again, 2007, 2017, and 2019. So here are the three moments. Firstly, 2007, the May 10th agreement, as it's known in 2007, makes it sound like it's some like peace agreement. No, I mean, sort of a peace agreement. It was between Democrats and Republicans, so that's often peaceful. Get there, woo, big celebration, yeah. So that's what we had on May 10th, 2007, and that was the moment when that compromise, that deal in itself, the domestic deal, allowed the labor provisions in U.S. trade agreements to now be enforceable in the same ways as the commercial provisions across those agreements. So just to put this in perspective, before May 10th, 2007, if there were a state-to-state dispute settlement case under a U.S. trade agreement and one party lost, you wouldn't be subject to the same sorts of remedies that you would be as under other commercial provisions, right? You would instead have, for example, have to pay money into a fund, like the losing party would pay money into a fund that would go to support labor reform. So now after May 10th, 2007, now it's like, okay, now we're really going to treat labor like the rest of the agreement. So that's a pretty important moment in this story for labor provisions. The second important milestone is, as mentioned, 2017. What happened in 2017? Well, a lot that maybe we might want to forget, but a lot happened in labor when it came to this case between the United States and Guatemala. That again will be familiar to many. And this was the first US case under a labor chapter of one of its free trade agreements, one of only two that we've had worldwide. We don't count now the EU South Korea case. But in 2017, the case finally ended. The case actually began in 2008, so it was a long time coming. But by 2017, the case had ended. And the key point here is not only that the U.S. lost, so that is the key point is that the U.S. lost, but in addition, it lost against Guatemala after 10 years, right? As a country that many thought was sort of the worst offender when it came to enforcing its labor provisions. And if the U.S. couldn't win against Guatemala, then what were any of these provisions for? Right? What do they mean? Do they have any value whatsoever? So that was a moment when the labor community in the US said, our trade agreements aren't doing enough on labor. We're just not doing enough. We need to do more. Okay, that brings us to milestone number 3, which is 2019, which is when we get USMCA, the new NAFTA, the new US-Mexico-Canada agreement, goes by different acronyms depending where you are. But USMCA, again, many will know, has yet another innovation to it, which is something called the Rapid Response Labor Mechanism, Labor Enforcement Mechanism, facility-specific Rapid Response Labor Enforcement Mechanism. Now, what is this Rapid Response Mechanism? Well, if you're bored at night, you can just scroll through my tweets because it's mostly what I tweet about these days. It's a good way to go to sleep. But the rapid response mechanism is an important development because it changes now the players in the labor story. Okay, so is that up until this point, when we're talking about labor provisions and trade agreements, there's the chapter, and then we enforce them under dispute settlement, state-to-state disputes. Rapid response, now it's not about state-to-state disputes. We're not going to a panel that's going to arbitrate among them and so forth. Instead, we're going to go after facilities. We're going to go after companies, particular work sites, and particularly in Mexico, where there are labor problems. So to put this in a very succinct way, what this tool does is it allows the mainly United States government to identify a denial of collective bargaining rights at a work site. So workers aren't allowed to unionize. Say they're having there's some reason why workers aren't being allowed to unionize. And when the US identifies this denial of rights at that particular work site or factory, it can then effectively stop the goods coming from that work site at the US border and not let them in or hold them up until the labor issue is resolved, or potentially exposing them to greater tariff penalties. So again, the difference here in institutional design is that now you have the US government going after a Mexican work site of any nationality, doesn't need to be a Mexican company, to try and resolve this issue of workers' rights. So this is what's captured the most attention at the moment. I'm happy to talk more about rapid response, talk about it all day long. We've used it now 11 times. You see the US government has invoked this 11 different times. We can get into its features if time permits. But I just want to leave here with this last thought here, which is taking that very quick overview of labor evolution in trade agreements, at least in the US context. I often ask, is the rapid response mechanism really the same as the others? As the old, if you watch Sesame Street, which one of these is not like the others, right? But this looks different. Right? This is sort of, we had apples, and now we have an orange. Right? This is a different sort of tool than we've had before. So I want to come back to that later in our discussion, but leave it there. Here.
Thank you. My next question is for Lauren. So as Kathleen's remarks made clear, there is a political dimension, a pretty clear political dimension to these provisions, both in how they've been generated in her case in the United States, but also how they are perceived around the world. You've been involved, I understand, in the process of reviewing UK FTAs or proposed FTAs for sustainability standards. And so I believe your chapter is going to be about some of the political debate about that in the UK and how this process is playing out. So please tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks. Although I should disclose, my chapter's not going to be about that, but I'm a bit of a sinner, so I'm not going to talk about the chapter. But I'm going to talk about this the political dimension because it's, I think, an interesting entry point into the sustainability revolution. So what I want to talk about is the UK's approach to sustainability and trade agreements, because I think it's a bit unique, actually. 2 years ago, the UK came up with the idea of having an independent commission to scrutinise free trade agreements to make sure that they wouldn't limit the UK's ability to have domestic standards and domestic standards in certain areas. It's not Labor, they don't care about that so much, well, at least not this government. But what they do care about, of course, British being British, anyone want to get animals, they care about animals. Right. No connection between the UK's love, or not so much love for workers and their love for animals, by the way. So they love animals. So it's very important for the UK that animal welfare standards should be protected in free trade agreements. Another area they were interested in was environment. So to make sure these FTAs wouldn't limit the UK's ability to do anything on environmental standards. And the third was to do with, health and safety, SPS type measures. Although we weren't allowed to look at food per se, but things around food, feed, animal feed, and so on. So they set up this commission, and I am the chair. Gracia, who is here, is also on the commission. Christian, who's up the back, has done some work with the commission, so we've pretty much staked out our positions here. And I think it's interesting to talk about just a little bit, because this is really the result of popular pressure, not us being on it, I should say, just the idea of it was a result of popular pressure. It obviously came from the farmers, right? Because it's about agriculture in particular, I should say. It's called the Trade and Agriculture Commission. It's about agricultural products. But it was driven by the farmers who were worried about the UK letting in too much agriculture. But there are two ways that they can fight this. The first line of defence is, of course, don't let the stuff in, which is what every country apart from the UK does. But the UK, in its wisdom, decided that it would let in all the stuff from Australia and from New Zealand. So you might not know this, but the UK, Australia and UK, New Zealand FTAs are basically 100% market access for everything, including agriculture, which, considering that the UK has a not particularly sustainable, dare I say, agricultural sector, is rough. Now, it's not immediate. They'll still have jobs for 15 years. But after that, we'll see how much of a job they actually still have. That's pretty unique. And the only reason for that is, it goes back to Brexit, that the only selling point for Brexit is that the UK can sign FTAs. And to be able to sign FTAs, you've got to have countries that will sign them with you. And if your best two friends in the world are agricultural exporters, well, you can see how the logic goes. And so it's not so great for the Welsh hill farmers and so on. But they had a second line of defence, and that's where we come in. So the second line of defence was, if we're going to have the stuff coming in, at least it should be the good stuff and not the bad stuff. And by good and bad, what I mean is, and this is the sustainability point, products, and they're not, well, they are agricultural products, but it's in terms of what the effects, it's broader than that. It covers deforestation, climate change, all sorts of things. The good stuff is stuff that is made according to standards that the UK would, broadly speaking, be happy with. So equivalent animal welfare standards, equivalent environmental standards, equivalent SPS type standards. The idea being that, because the UK is a wonderfully free trading nation, that they can put up with competition, so long as it's fair competition. They don't want to put up with unfair competition. Unfair here not being in the US sense of cheap, just because it's cheap. Unfair here being unfair because it's made according to lower standards than the UK would put up. And so what we had to do with this mandate, which was to look at what the FTA's likely effect was going to be on the UK standards, a number of things. So one, there's a legal dimension. That's what Gracia and I spend our time doing, which is to look at the exceptions essentially, and we take WTO law as a baseline or pre-existing FTAs as a baseline. We're about to look at CPTPP, for instance. So there's a whole lot of pre-existing UK FTAs which set the baseline there, including the Australian and New Zealand one. And we say, well, under the pre-existing rules, can the UK limit, for instance, products that come in palm oil, for instance, palm oil, which may lead to deforestation in Malaysia, for argument's sake. We haven't looked at it yet, so I can't say what our decision on that might be, but that's a question that we're obviously going to have to look at. And so the question is a legal question. If there were to be a worst case scenario where palm oil, led to dead orangutans and lots of deforestation and whatnot, could the UK do less about that now than they could before the agreement was signed? And that's an important methodological qualifier because, of course, your average person out there on the street couldn't care less about WTO law. They want to know if we can stop it full stop. But we decided that we would make our lives a bit easier and just limit ourselves to the status quo versus what might happen after the agreement comes into force. And I should say that we write an advice that goes to the Minister for Trade. It also goes to Parliament. And essentially we perform a constitutional function because the government has undertaken not to ask for permission to ratify the FTA until our advice has been put before Parliament. And that's also, I think, interesting and unique, and it's an independent commission. I don't think anyone else in the world has anything quite like this. I think it's a pretty good idea, actually. It's better than just asking your, pet consultancy to write a positive report or getting, the unions to tell you how awful the agreement is, which is the American approach, or just having it all done in-house, which is, nobody will take seriously. So I think having an independent commission with farmers on it, academics on it, there's a range of different interests, vets on it, and so on. I think that's quite interesting. But anyway, so that's our question. Our first question is legal, but we also go a bit further than that, and this is because and this is the main point of interest, I think, for today, is that we are very much in the mix at the moment, which is why we all took on this job, because it's fun and interesting, and trade law in practice is obviously more interesting than just trade law out of books. We are in the mix of what does free trade mean for a country, right? Which hasn't really experienced this. Of course, the UK has, but they delegated their big brains to the process for a long time, and so they're now retrieving their brain and they're trying to think about what trade liberalisation actually means. And so we are at the interface of, on the one hand, the trade liberalisers who think that it's trade's great. And of course, on the other hand, the animal welfare NGOs, the farmers, and so on, who are all into, no, we must maintain standards. And if that means no more stuff coming in, so much the better. All right. And so what is interesting is to see what people are interested in. And I would have to say that even the farmers, you might not think this, you might think farmers are protectionists, they'll come up with any ropey arguments they can think of to stop being put under import competition. It's not actually the case. They actually, in the UK, so far at least, seem to mean it when they say that we will put up with imports so long as they are made fairly. And one of our jobs is to explain to them that a lot of the talk about so far how awful the Australians are. The New Zealanders, of course, are always wonderful. No, they couldn't find anything bad to say that. But the Australians obviously are terrible. They mutilate their sheep. They do actually mutilate their sheep. They do that. But it is pretty grim. But anyway, the point is that, you know, so long as the stuff is made in an okay way, it seems to be so far that what we get through Parliament, what we get through the submissions that come to us and just generally, you know, hanging out, talking to the media and so on, is that they actually are genuine about thinking that trade that is made according to decent standards is okay. Now, that doesn't mean that the farmers are happy about being run out of town and they're going to have their hand out for all that EU money that no longer exists and so on, right? So the political problem is still there. But it is, I think, it has been an education. It's been interesting to see that actually there is a sense that there is a difference, and this is the sustainability point, that even for those who could really suffer, which, you know, the equivalent would be the unions in the US, even those who could really suffer from import competition, they actually do seem to be genuine about accepting trade so long as it meets basic standards. Now, our job, and I'm not going to go through it in any detail, I'll stop now, is really myth busting, because people will say things like the Australians mutilate their sheep. Well, they do. But that, you know, but they also said things like, if you import lamb from New Zealand, it's going to be bad for climate change. And that turned out to be the opposite, which actually gave me great pleasure as a trade lawyer to be able to say in Parliament. Didn't make many friends, except in Wellington. But I actually said, if you care about the climate, you should buy New Zealand lamb, not Welsh lamb. And that just is what the stats say. That's just true. So, because, you know, they've got grass, and in the UK, they don't have grass, essentially. There's not enough. You know, this sort of myth busting is what we do, but it's all, I think, just to sort of finish up, the sustainability revolution, I think, in real time. And it's been quite interesting to watch and to participate in that.
Thank you. So I think one thing that you know, is perhaps obvious, but comes out of the conversation pretty clearly so far, is that a lot of these sustainability provisions and initiatives come out of demands that come out of you know, high-income Western countries, and therefore I think it's predictable that this sustainability revolution is going to look quite different depending on where you stand around the world. Many people might be concerned about the impact on other economies, the developing world in particular. So to kind of start offering a response to this idea, I'd like to turn to James and ask, what do things look like from your perspective? How does the turn to sustainability look like from where you sit and what you study? And what concerns may arise as to who may be left out or affected by this, and perhaps not an entirely positive way?
Thank you. In fact, I was also part of this book project. So I wrote a chapter on the role of development and sustainable development. So it actually looks at some of the free trade agreements and try to find out what kind of provisions are there in these agreements, and will it basically undermine or derail the scope of development. So when we really look at the sustainable development chapter of a free trade agreement, there are multiple provisions that actually deal with sustainability. So one is definitely labor, the second is environment, then we have got gender, you have got sustainable food systems, there are anti-corruption provisions, there are sustainability in government procurement for the matter. So in a way, most of these provisions actually require the FTA part. And my study was actually in the context of a free trade agreement. And what we understood, what I found was that in most of these FTA provisions, there is actually a requirement to conform or maybe adjust your practice with certain kind of an international standard for that matter. So when it comes to improving your standard, basically these standards are actually set by international organizations. Most of the trade agreements in the sustainability chapter has a very long reference to a number of multilateral agreements. And when I speak about the multilateral agreement, I speak about the multilateral environment agreement. The Rio Declaration for that matter, the Johannesburg Declaration, the Paris Agreement, the Minamata Convention, the Stockholm Declaration. So there are many references to all these agreements for that matter. And what are these provisions actually trying to say? Most of the obligations in multilateral environmental agreements are very soft obligations. And even if a country or a party to that agreement hasn't taken enough measures or steps in order to implement these kind of international obligations at the domestic level, there is pretty much little the other countries or the members of the multilateral environment or international agreement can do. So the objective of the trade agreement, the sustainability chapter of this agreement, is to make sure that these soft obligations, which are basically a feature of all these multilateral agreements, are given some kind of a binding force at the free trade agreement level. So in a way, I think all these agreements are trying to bring in some kind of non-economic or non-instrumental values into the system. But there's a fundamental problem with respect to the meaning of the term development. So we know that the term development actually, basically talks about three vital aspects. One is actually economic development. The other is environment protection. And the third is basically social development or social inclusion for that matter. In the context of developing countries, the economic development was such an important consideration. Most of the countries really believed that free trade agreements can actually lift all boats and that they can actually overcome the problems of poverty and get into a higher economic growth for that matter. So all these kind of developing countries actually entered into this trade agreement expecting that there could be reciprocal market access in these countries and they can actually enter the market without too many conditionalities. But when all these kind of non-economic objectives and other things are coming into the free trade agreements through the TSD chapter, in a way, it is actually amounting to a kicking away of the ladder. You give them something through kind of market access openings, but at the same time, you're actually kicking it away if that country cannot actually implement this commitment at the domestic level. And let me tell you, so far, these agreements are not binding. Of course, I think Kathleen spoke about the Guatemala dispute, and we are also very familiar with the Korea dispute that happened a bit later. The problem is that even very small commitments, even a commitment to actually effectively implement a trade and sustainability provision or a multilateral agreement can be enforced through the free trade agreement, if that agreement has got a dispute settlement chapter. So most of the different countries have got different kind of approaches. In the European Union, so far, it has been non-sanction based. But if you were to look at the new trends, it is actually going to be sanction based. In the United States, it is going to be, in the USMC or in some of the agreements, it is actually a sanction-based approach. Even in Canada, it is a sanction-based approach. And not only a sanction-based approach, let me actually talk about one particular sensitivity. If a particular labor union in India is not given certain kind of rights, assume that India has got a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom, the trade union in India can actually approach the United Kingdom, maybe the Department of International Trade, and ask them to file a dispute against India under the free trade agreement chapter. To many countries, this is absolutely shocking. If you have got a problem with respect to the enforceability of a matter, you have to actually file a dispute in your domestic legal system. And your domestic legal system will tell you what to do, will enforce your law. That's purely a domestic matter. So many developing countries have got a huge amount of concerns with respect to the free trade agreements actually becoming a tool or a platform for the soft obligations, which are multiple in several multilateral environmental or labor agreements coming through the back door. That's a major concern for the matter. Then we also talk about the concept of development. So there is a 1996 declaration which was actually arrived at. The 1996 Singapore Ministerial Declaration said that if a developing country has got a particular comparative advantage in terms of a cheap labor or cheap factors of production, it is their comparative advantage. But if you really look at some of the modern free trade agreement, it says if any country is not actually implementing a particular labor or environment or any other provision in a proper way, it can actually amount to conferring those countries a comparative advantage, and that particular comparative advantage has to be neutralized. So again, I think when it comes to special development provisions, you have to understand that developing countries were extremely sensitive. They actually spend their hard labor in protecting these rights. And one small point which I want to mention is the concept of common but differential responsibilities and respective capabilities. If you look at the Paris Agreement, every country can actually make a nationally determined contribution. It is up to that country to choose that particular thing and set a target. But if you really look at some of the free trade agreements, there is a provision which actually requires the parties to commit to what they have internally set. And if they are not actually stuck to that particular, they are not doing it the implementation in a proper way, there can be dispute settlement. So these are all problematic issues. And the point is that nowadays many countries are coming with a multiple number of standards. Some of them are actually in the field of sustainable food system. Some of them may be with respect to what you call as Indonesian example. Yeah. What do you call it? Yeah, animal welfare for that matter. So some of these are fairly complicated for that matter. So if you use a free trade agreement, it can be a problem. Let me also tell you one thing. It is a myth it is an absolute myth that developing countries are actually able to get a comparative advantage by weakening the labor standard. In the WTO, there is actually an agreement where the least developed countries are actually given duty-free and quota-free access. So that means their import into the other countries completely free. It is almost like a free trade agreement. But look at the trade statistics. Are the African countries able to increase their exports under the duty-free quota-free system? No. So the point is that even if you give a duty-free quota-free system, that doesn't actually provide you the market access. There are many things which should be done by the countries themselves. Even the developing countries will have to actually improve their physical infrastructure. They have to do a lot of right things, improve their productivity. All these things are required in order to gain a foothold in the international market. So the problem which I am highlighting in this particular in this chapter is that to an extent we can have certain kind of values when we trade. Trade cannot be without values. That's absolutely right. But if we attach too many strings to it, if we attach monetary sanctions to it, if we come up with this kind of mechanism, which again is actually too much intrusive for a country, you have to look at it from that particular point of view, then there will be a backlash. And many developing countries believe that the hardened, the kind of development space which they fought through decades, in fact, cannot be wiped out by this kind of free trade agreements. And again, this is actually a concern. The positions they have completely, there is a kind of an inconsistency here. Most of the developing countries are completely opposed to these issues being negotiated at the WTO, which in many ways is actually a safer form. But at the same time, these countries are willy-nilly entering into the same agreements in a free trade agreement where they have got a dispute settlement provisions. So they have to be pretty much aware of these particular issues. I'll stop here and look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And this is actually a great segue into Yuka's intervention, because one of the questions that looms very large as this sustainability revolution progresses is that most, if not all of it, is taking place outside of the multilateral system. So, from where you stand, you guys, an expert on the WTO, how do things look? Is this an instance yet again of the multilateral system becoming increasingly marginalized in the newer developments in international economic law? Or is there perhaps a bit of a silver lining? Are there perhaps positive implications that could flow to the multilateral system eventually?
Thank you. First of all, I have to say I feel very uncomfortable being called the WTO expert in front of this group of WTO experts. And I have to say that what I'm going to do here is just to give my very general observation about what's happening. And you just said that not much is happening in the WTO and many things are happening outside the WTO, especially in the context of FTAs. But what I'm going to say is that actually many things have happened in the WTO. And if I may go back to your question about whether there is a revolution or evolution, to me, it's what is happening now in the WTO and also in FTAs is rather evolutionary, not revolutionary. Because if you look at, for example, Havana Charter, there is a provision, there's no word sustainability, but there is a provision related to social sustainability. And if you look at Article 20 of the GATT, again, Article 20 does not use the word sustainability, but it embodies the concept of sustainability. So sustainability always exists in the multilateral trading system. And also this sustainability has, the role of sustainability has been increasing gradually over the course of time. And those developments have happened through WTO dispute settlement practice. And perhaps, of course, in addition to the jurisprudence related to Article 20 of GATT, there's another new kind of development. And recently we witnessed the adoption of the agreement on fisheries subsidies. This is quite new, and this is very monumental, and we could probably call that revolutionary. But I think it's just a very tiny portion of the comprehensive WTO system. And majority of the WTO agreements are related to trade globalization. So I don't see the adoption of the agreement of fisheries subsidies as a revolution. It's still an evolution. It's still a continuation of what has happened in the WTO. But if there is anything that we can call a revolution, I think it's probably people's perception of the WTO and the fact that we're talking about sustainability in the WTO, or if you look at the program of the SIEL, there are so many sessions about sustainability. So people's perception has changed dramatically. So we could probably say that this is a revolution, but we can't say that WTO went through a revolution. Now, in the remaining time, I think I'm going to talk a bit about my book chapter, the book that Kathleen and other speakers were talking about. And my book discusses interactions between WTO and FTAs regarding environmental sustainability. And when we talk about interactions between the WTO and FTAs, we tend to focus on FTAs, like you just said, and we tend to discuss whether what's happening in FTA or new sustainability provisions in FTAs can be incorporated in the WTO. But my book chapter tries to deal with, well, the interactions actually are happening in both ways. It's not just FTA's provisions may have an impact on the WTO, but it's also what's happening in the WTO may have an impact on the FTAs. And as I said earlier, there are many things happening in the context of the WTO. And in my chapter, I highlighted the WTO dispute settlement practice regarding Article 20. And I'm not going to speak about the WTO DS practice of Article 20. Everyone knows those things. But let me highlight just two pronouncements made by the appellate body on this point. One is a pronouncement by the appellate body in Kathleen case, and the appellate body says, yeah, it's not to be read in clinical isolation from public international law, as you already know. And another one is the pronouncement by another pronouncement by the appellate body in shrimp case. And the appellate body says that the paragraph 1 of the preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement must add color, texture, and shading to the interpretation of the WTO agreement. And paragraph 1 of the preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement acknowledges the need to protect and preserve the environment and the need to respect the objective of sustainable development. So I think one of the important implications of this pronouncement is that they sort of expanded the scope of the principle of systemic integration. And the systemic integration means that a treaty has to be interpreted harmoniously with another treaty. And when you think about the principle of systemic integration, you may think about Article 31.3c of the Vienna Convention. And as you know, Article 31.3c of the CLT says that any relevant rules of international law applicable in the relations between the parties shall be taken into account in the interpretation of a treaty. And there are so many discussions about what relevant rules of international law applicable in the relations between the parties. And depending on the size of the relevant rules, blah, 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 and perhaps the panels and the blah, can take into account some treaties, or they may not be able to take into account other treaties and so on. So we discussed a lot about the scope of any relevant rules of international law, blah, blah, blah. So, but I think we have to be aware, and the appellate body has highlighted that Article 31(3)(c) only talks about relevant rules of international law applicable in the relations between the parties that have to be taken into account. And this provision is silent on what can be considered as a context. And I think what can be considered as a context is very broad. Even not just the treaty, but even the fact, even the dialogue can be considered as a context in the interpretation of a treaty, in the interpretation of the WTO agreement. And I think the pronouncements I just mentioned highlighted this broad scope of the principle of systemic integration, and that helped the evolution of the WTO law in relation to environmental sustainability. So I think I stop here.
Thank you very much. So now that we've sort of aired out some of the big questions here, I'd like to give each of you just a few minutes in turn to maybe tell us a little bit more about some of your perspective on this, and if you want, respond to some perspectives that have been aired by the others. But I'll throw in a couple of ideas or questions that you might want to tell us about. One of them is about the big picture. If we take a step back now and we think about what this turn towards sustainability might mean for the future of the global economy, will this be a story of conflict or a story of complementarity? How do we think about this in terms of the design of future trade agreements and its institutional design, and how it's going to perhaps transform what we see? Or if you want to talk about something a bit more specific, is there anything that we have missed that we haven't talked about so far that is an important development that you think would be worth bringing to the audience's attention? And how about we go from I guess left to right, starting with James. Okay.
In fact, so when we look at this particular crisis that we are in it together. So in the sense that when it comes to sustainability, at least from the point of view of my particular paper, my argument is that the developed and the developing countries are not actually at loggerheads. Because the developing countries are basically facing the brunt of all this climate change. But the problem is that what is the best method of enforcing sustainability? Is it better to have a sanction-based approach? If you're actually going for a sanction-based approach, then it is something very similar to the ISDS. Let me tell you, when a particular party has to provide compensation, I'm not talking about a private party, even a government providing compensation. It is not, the political economy is not that easy. All governments have got great difficulty in agreeing to something where money has to be paid from the public institute. And my own feeling is that then it can actually lead to some kind of a disengagement. If sanction is the way of bringing in, conformity or compliance with sustainability standards, I think the divide will be further enlarged. And in the long run, sometimes you can actually threaten some countries, but you can't threaten all the countries. If a particular country is too much dependent on the other country's market, perhaps you can threaten that country. But the reality is that not every country is actually so developed. And I think that will lead to a very acrimonious debate. And my feeling is that what happened to investment treaties, at least in the last decade, will happen to trade and sustainability provisions. So it is actually the responsibility of the richer countries, the countries that can provide transfer technology, the countries that can provide mutually supportive practices, to come forward and provide a lending rate. On this particular point, let me tell you, even the pledge taken in the Paris Agreement is not compliant with. Whenever there is a provision in any trade agreement that provides for some kind of voluntary technology transfer, rest assured that it won't happen. So unless some kind of a tangible thing is going to happen, it will be very impossible to believe that the norm takers will actually comply with all these things. So the important point is that it's a long-run thing. Sustainability is extremely important in the world, but it takes a huge amount of effort. It can be done through many ways. So trade may not be the only way of, I think, instilling the sense of promoting sustainable practice. There could be many multiple ways of doing it. Providing this kind of thing as a curriculum in educational institutions is the best thing. Teach these kind of habits from a very young age or early age for that matter. I think we have to understand the fact that trade is not a panacea for everything, and trade agreements cannot actually bring in everything. So in this area, my feeling is that there has to be greater complementarity, greater supportiveness, and an attitude of not punishing your trading partner. If there is a case of a case of violation of the labor and environment standard, admittedly, no country would like to violate a standard. No country would like to violate an environment standard. It happens because the country's machinery may be very poor, or they may not have the kind of resources to implement it. Why should a country actually, let me talk about my own country, India. In India, we can't even enforce the traffic rules. But when the lawmakers actually make the traffic rules, do they have an intention of not enforcing it? No. But sometimes it is actually a matter of culture, a matter of practice. This will all require a certain kind of time, persuasion, teaching in schools and other things. So my feeling is that trade is only one of the many things that we can use in order to bring in, in order to infuse a sense of sustainability. And there are many things that we can do also. So it should be mutually supportive, complementary, not punishing.
Yeah, look, if we're talking big picture, I might have a slightly different take on it. And I think there used to be more of a sanctions mentality, but I think the last time that was properly done outside of, say, a human rights or a geopolitical context was probably in the Montreal Protocol. And I think the WTO has been a big success in the sense of saying you can't do that. So I think the way it looks now is not so much with sanctions. I don't see it in terms of sanctions. I think the way I see it is, ground rules, which is to say we will accept trade according to certain ground rules. Now, some ground rules have always been there, like, for instance, slavery, right? I mean, everyone has always accepted, well, at least different countries have different cut-off dates for this, but let's say for at least 100 years or so, that you shouldn't have to accept imports that are made by slavery, let alone slavery being the topic of your trade. But over the years, what those ground rules cover has changed. And I think what we are looking at now is a negotiation of ground rules, which include, for instance, animal welfare starting to creep in, climate starting to creep in. I think all that we're haggling over at the moment is saying that certain types of economic activity will not be able to benefit from trade liberalisation because we think it's not worth it. So I think that's what's really at stake in all of this. I don't think the mechanisms of enforcement are all that material, but I think that's essentially the big picture. And of course, it can get. There's also another dimension very, very quickly, which became prominent in the EU-UK trade negotiations, not really the Brexit divorce agreement, but the sort of later agreement, trade and cooperation agreement, where you ended up with the toughest. They call them level playing field obligations, but essentially it's labour and environment, a bit of climate change as well. The toughest ones in the world. So in fact, even tougher than the US. And the UK is not allowed to regress at all beyond the rules that it had on the date of that agreement. For the EU, they're a bit clever when it comes to negotiations. So it's not the EU's rules, it's the member states' rules. Sorry, all the way around, member states' rules, not the EU's rules, not member states' rules, which can be higher. So the EU's baseline rules. Member states, they can still come down a little bit if they're allowed to under the EU law. But the point is that this was very hotly negotiated by the EU because they didn't want the UK to engage in a form of regulatory subsidization by, producing according to lower standards, which gives you a sense of how much money is there. Right? This is essentially an economic issue. this attempt to drive out regulatory subsidization. So how can we link that back to the first point, which is the ground rules for values reasons? It's because the EU wants to save the world, wants to save itself, and that's going to cost money. And it knows that its standards are expensive, and it doesn't want these standards to be undercut by its new neighbour, an independent UK. So I think the way the modern economy works can't even just look at environment, labour, and so on as values. You have to appreciate, and of course it was always there, but now it's much more to the fore. Quite how much of an economic dimension there is to this, as we look at economies becoming greener and greener.
Well, I think I make a very, very general observation. As many speakers mentioned, there are innovative provisions in FTAs, especially signed by the United States, the UK, or the EU. And maybe the question for me is whether those innovative sustainability provisions in FTAs can be incorporated into the WTO, and that is a question for many trade lawyers. But I think it's really a very general observation, but I think lawyers overemphasized the importance of binding rules or binding dispute settlement system. And we always want to see new innovative provisions in trade agreements. If we can see new provisions in bilateral trade agreements, it's good. But if we can see those agreements in the multilateral trade agreement, it's even better. So we negotiate. It takes time. But anyway, we try to adopt binding rules. But I think in the current international environment, it may not make sense to try to negotiate binding rules when we reach an agreement. It's probably already outdated, and so perhaps lawyers may underestimate the importance of things other than hard law, which includes soft law, of course, declarations, guidelines, and so on. But even just having a dialogue may have an impact on people's mindset, and by that way, probably maybe businesses may change their conduct, and by that we can achieve the objectives of sustainability. So the objective is to achieve sustainability. Objective is not to make sophisticated rules. So perhaps we may have to change our thinking mode and try to think differently and appreciate more soft law and other instruments.
Well, Yuka said it earlier that this is a room of experts. So everyone in the room, I think, is thinking or writing about a related topic to what we've been talking about today. So I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone's comments and reactions here in a moment. But so given that, I think I would put a question to the group, what do you think is motivating this on the social side, really? I think the environmental side is a different sort of story, but on the social side, I'm glad we've used the magic words, level the playing field, because I think that I see that as being the motivating factor in the early days. I'm not sure that is anymore. It's really hard for me to draw a line from the indigenous peoples provisions to leveling the playing field arguments. Maybe the people have surely written that. I'm not sure, but so is this about leveling the playing field, or have things changed? Maybe it depends who you ask, and so this is just politics at work, and this is great. We're all sort of coalescing, and yet trade's values. You both spoke to this, and what counts as a value anymore? It's very much the Biden administration is using this language all the time of trade's values and for good, using trade as a force for good. Ambassador Tai says. She's meaning sort of democracy, it seems in some way, but so whose values, of course, what counts as a value? And then we come to the question that I think Sergio referred to once to me, which was, are we just using these coercive tactics to achieve progressive ends? So it's okay when we use sustainability tools to achieve what we think are sustainability objectives, right? These sort of important things, but we're actually using the same sorts of tools, right? You look at rapid response, but we are coercing companies to do things in the interest of collective bargaining rights, right? And that's not too dissimilar from what China might use in the interest of different sorts of outcomes, right? So at what cost are we asking these of the various constituencies? And you can really see, I think, the U.S. language shift over time in the way that I just mentioned, right? We never talked in the trade policy space about human rights until recently, but we talked about leveling the playing field for a long time. So just trying to sort of find those points of intersection and reconcile them, I think, is an ongoing piece. The second thing I would say goes to Pierre's question of where we go from here. And I want to get back to the carrots and sticks, sort of sanctions or non-sanctions a discussion we've been having. I think where we go from here is trying to get that balance right. You see governments wrestling with this. You see it particularly in IPEF, at least the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. That now, will there be a rapid response? What will labor look like in a deal that doesn't have it doesn't have any enforcement mechanism or some binding commitments, but not as strong as we're used to? Well, the talk is maybe there'll be more carrots. And it's not that these sticks come with no carrots, right? To be sure, like when rapid response was instituted in USMCA, it came with a lot of money and a lot of aid that was intended to complement the Mexican labor reform process that was already underway completely independently of what rapid response would do. So it's not entirely intended as a stick. In that sense, it's intended as a complement. Whether it's achieving that, I think, is a different question. But when we talk about will there be something like rapid response in IPEF going forward, it's pretty clear this thing is not easily replicable. It was, in some ways, as I mentioned, this in the context of the broader Mexican labor reform, it was a bespoke design at a relatively unique political moment. I mean, that those milestones I mentioned, those don't come along every day, as you heard. There's just these few. So whether we can see something like that, we may be taking these sort of individually tailored social sustainability tools in these individual relationships, right? There may not be a broader takeaway that we can gain from it. I think it's worth spending more time on evaluating the negative effects of these, as James has sort of called to our attention. And we're not doing that enough with rapid response, that's for sure. James, you said something about coming in through the back door. Rapid response comes in through the front door, right? It doesn't say you have to file, right? As you said, it doesn't care if you filed in the Mexican courts, your labor problem. That's great. You can do the Mexican court stuff and go on all along, but we're just going to come in and do it and fix your labor problem. And whatever happening in the Mexican court system, we don't really care. So you may create some complications in doing that, but we don't really care. It's also interesting if you look at who's bringing these petitions for these rapid response mechanisms, right? It's US, mostly US labor groups, it's US NGOs, some Mexican labor participants, but it's not about capacity building. This is the sticks without a lot of consideration about what the ripple effect might be. Now, Mexico's pushing back in the last couple of weeks. We've heard them start to push back a little bit on this exercise. But if you think about it, I mean, why did this work in the first place, and why might other governments find something like this attractive? Well, it's in part because it pushes the attention, as I said earlier, this is the orange in our apples and oranges, to the attention of the company. Right? If the sanction's not on Mexico, the sanction is on the companies that are affected. And that could be very attractive. I don't want to face the costs. Just because I don't have the capacity to enforce my labor laws doesn't mean that I should be punished. Let's go after the bad companies. Now, querying whether the companies themselves are the bad actors here, that's not entirely clear in the rapid response context. But no, I think I would just, my takeaway for where we go from here, Pierre, is there's still a lot of right sizing happening, but not a lot of moments of reflection to sort of look at these tools in motion and point out the things that my colleagues have spoken about, to say, okay, well, look, this is actually how this is affecting this and how this is affecting that. We just sort of plow ahead, right? And say, we're going to do more social sustainability. This is how we're going to do it. Meanwhile, no one's really stepped back and said, for example, in rapid response, you went after GM, you went after General Motors in the very first case. That's great. Everybody thought in that moment, when you go after General Motors, you're going to go after these big brands. They're going to have a lot of, there's going to be a deterrent effect because they're going to really care and they're going to change their ways. But then if you look at who they went after General Motors, they're all these little tiny companies that no one's ever heard of. And what do they make? They make armrests or headrests for your car, for example. You can't replace, nobody else besides General Motors can make a Sierra truck, right? That's them. But lots of different companies can make armrests and headrests. So if you go after that little company that's making the armrests and you put them out of business in effect by a rapid response exercise there, then GM or somebody else, Volkswagen, they're going to go call another armrest company, right? So thinking through, now that company closes and you've just put those workers out of a job, the very workers you were trying to help. So it's those sorts of moments of evaluation saying, hey, how are these social sustainability tools working in practice that I think we need a lot more of?
Thank you. Well, as you pointed out, we have a very expert audience and we're lucky to have a very good turnout. So I think this would be a good time to turn to the audience for Q&A. If you agree on this, if no one protests, all right. So,
I was provoked by Kathleen comments on a good way. And I think, and Catherine knows this, that I was one of the objectors to the rapid response. And maybe looking in some years after, there were, I think, three objections that I had to the mechanism. It was highly intrusive and sanction-based. And looking at from now, and kind of comparing to what happened in the Guatemalan case, which to me was a more shotgun approach, say all your companies, all your sectors violate labor laws. I think this is, and I'm not retracting that I think it's intrusive, but I do think that they have some benefits to that. Because at the end, it places the problem in the company, and it takes out these other sectors and making it a whole out of the companies sectors themselves, but more focused, and I think that's fine. My other objection was it was not reciprocal, and at the end, I would want to see Mexican companies challenge U.S. companies within the U.S. on not complying with that. So that was my second objection, and I think it's still there. And the other one goes to Catherine's last point, which is it really this? And my third objection was, are we really talking about trade? Are we really, because what happened in the USMCA was basically this requirement of having a trade effect was flush. So what do you do? And at the end, it goes to level of playing field. Are you really complaining about, is this small company in Mexico really harming US exports? And that was what the previous agreements had, which is you have to have a trade component. It has to affect trade. It has to affect competition. Otherwise, if you want to be the vigilant of countries on labor and environment, good luck in setting up discipline for that. But at the end, I think that's to me the discussion of whether you want this system, this mechanism. I mean, I would not object to any thinking of more labor friendly, more environment. Nobody will object to that. But the issue is, are we talking about trade agreements? These are trade agreements. These need to have a trade component. Otherwise, you only use trade as a hammer. So, I mean, at the end, all Mexican companies, they comply with these 11 cases because they had to do it otherwise. And I think the Mexican government didn't want any panel at all on this. But the companies comply because they don't want to be subject to sanction. Even some of them, and it's important when you get into the granular part, some of the US actions really entail putting restrictions on trade, others not. And we don't know why, what was the trigger of those actions. So at the end, it's to me, it is important, you have to do it. Maybe the approach is not, maybe some things we need to take in from this approach, but the problem is you have to make it trade. Right? And otherwise, you enter into a discussion that I think nobody wants to have.
Should we take more questions, or yes, let's take a few more.
So all thank you so much for this very important presentation and conversation and the book that you announced. I have a sort of comment on the considerations just made by Professor Ramirez. Do we want trade agreements with so many sustainability aspects? I think that we have to consider that in 2015, it was adopted by consensus at the General Assembly of the United Nations, the 2030 Agenda with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, it is just a piece of soft law, but it has already been remarked in the brilliant opening sessions this morning that soft law is becoming more and more relevant in every aspect of international relations and also in the work that we do on international law. So I think that the issue is an issue also of coherence. So what do we do? Do we practice in the field of trade ignoring the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda, ignoring that a large part of the countries in the world conclude the fundamental conventions of the International Labour Organization, the multilateral environmental agreements, and so on and so forth? Or do we try to be coherent? Of course, when we try to be coherent, we can commit many mistakes in the draft of the trade provisions, but usually more than problems in the treaty tools, I think that there are problems in the autonomous measures. For instance, I do think that the recent autonomous measures, as they are called now, by the European Union have a significant number of problematic aspects that should be looked into more depth. So I do think that there is this issue of coherence, and also there is the issue of the intervention, the more and more significant intervention of parliaments in the ratification of these agreements. And you have civil society, you have NGOs that are becoming more and more vocal if you do not consider sustainability aspects. Now, another issue would be to inquiry with precision on who pays, who finances the civil society and the NGOs. But I do think that it's an issue of coherence. So
maybe one more before we yes.
Just a very straightforward question. My name is Sawen. I'm Mr. Dylan. You mentioned the principle of combat difference with responsibilities, and it's also a question for all of you. We, Colombia, many of the trade agreements have that principle as one of the umbrella principle that govern the agreement. Given these tensions between environmental concerns, trade concerns, we have seen that many capabilities of developing countries and small producers are just leave aside because the issue of not being able to export. I've seen that with the European Union, the new standards on pesticides, for instance, MRLs, that also the UK is replicating. So how can a country like Colombia, like a developing country, to maybe vindicate those kind of principles? In the framework of the free trade agreement, it's there, but we don't use it. And unfortunately, we have not been able to invoke it.
So why don't we take those first and then maybe go on one? So whoever wants to answer.
Can I answer this one? So I think one interesting, from a developing country point of view, from a differentiated responsibility and actually even an environmental mindset, what I'm starting to formulate in my mind is that the trade regime has to decide between, looking at what the EU is doing, for instance, two different mentalities. So a trade war mentality is very product-based. So you would, for instance, say, we make cars using whatever, something good, and you guys make cars using something bad. And so we're not going to let your cars in. And that's the way the trade regime is designed, right? You do it on a product by product basis, essentially. But the environmental regime doesn't look like that. An environmental regime looks at what countries do, right? And your NDCs are on a countrywide basis. And so the question would be for the EU, well, how can we hit you with a CBAM charge on your cars if, maybe your cars are as grotty as hell, but you're growing trees by the trillion, and so overall you're doing the right thing. Why should the EU be doing this on a product by product basis when actually the mindset from an environmental point of view is entirely different, let alone historical, responsibilities and all the rest of it, right? So I think that that's a clash. And so far in the EU, which is what I mainly focus on, they're very happy with the product basis. Very, very happy with the product basis because it suits them. But I'm not sure that that's right. And I think that this is, we always have mutual support, this environment, trade, blah, blah, blah. Well, fine. We've sorted out a lot of that over the years. But this, I think, mentality about country-based contributions to climate change, combating climate change versus a product-based model, I think that is a clash that's going to become more common. I can't answer what to do about Colombia. I mean, good luck.
I just want to mention one point that, most of the trade agreements have got a bespoke kind of a template. So in my paper, I actually refer to it called the party, this is basically a non-regression clause in an agreement. So the parties cannot actually make a recurring and sustained efforts for that matter. That particular provision has become so common in all free trade agreements. Even if you want to tweak the language, it is almost impossible. So that's the point is that in a free trade agreement, it is very difficult to negotiate special and differential provision. But in the context of multilateral agreement, it is much easier. So whatever you have negotiated in the context of a multilateral agreement can be wiped out by having a TSD provision in a free trade agreement, where you are actually negotiating on a one-on-one basis. So there is, these kind of special concessions will not be given in a free trade agreement. So there is a simple point.
Very briefly about coherence with SDGs, I completely agree with what you said. And I think treaty has to be interpreted like in the previous roundtable session. Treaty has to be interpreted in an evolutionary manner. That's one thing. And also a treaty has to be interpreted in the broader context of international law. And I said in my intervention that an international law treaty has to be interpreted in light of another treaty, but not just in light of another treaty, but more broader legal instrument, not just legal instrument, but broader international instruments. So probably the WTO agreement has to be interpreted in light of SDGs and some other declarations or resolutions and so on. So SDGs have to be definitely reflected in the interpretation of the WTO agreement. That does not mean that we can modify the WTO agreements by incorporating SDGs, but as long as possible, we should reflect the SDGs in the interpretation of the WTO agreement.
Why don't we do more, and I'll just say things at the end.
Okay, yeah, we have many questions around, so let's take a few more. Ben?
Thank you. This may just be a recent it seems to me in this discussion about whether these values belong in a trade agreement tends to naturalize what we call trade. A trade agreement, what a trade component is, right? Whereas that's not a static concept and never has been, right? Trade and full employment where the two values that came together and formed a monetary system. And so you could also think about this moment of sustainability as challenging our dominant conception of what a trade agreement is. And maybe our dominant conception has been highly legalistic. A trade agreement has disciplines which impose restrictions on state conduct, which then, when transcended, results in some kind of law-finding process that leads to a sanction, right? And whereas a trade agreement could be a platform for redistribution, for redistributing market access, for redistributing financial support and transfer of technology in order to sort of bolster the entire global economy and ensure full employment, right? And if sustainability were integrated into that concept, it would make sense. It would just be a sensible part of a global trade regime. And I guess maybe the problem is that we're instead integrating sustainability into our background conception of trade regime, which is a regime of disciplines and sanctions, right? And so again, I'm sorry if I'm just simply stating, but that's what strikes me as like the dissonance in like what I'm hearing coming from that. Thank you very much. It's been really fun.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks for this wonderful discussion. Thanks actually for the project on this book. To me, treating labor standards and labor provisions as a solid example of enforceable social sustainability provisions is in itself problematic. Because when we talk about labor provisions and we say, well, here is an example of social sustainability provisions that have been made highly enforceable by rapid response mechanism. Yes, because labor provisions in a way are trade concerns, and not to some extent social concerns. They are directly trade related, and they make all the trade sense. We cannot say the same about other social sustainability provisions that we have included in the book, such as gender equality, indigenous communities, environment, disability inclusion rights, because they're clearly we cannot relate them in the same manner to trade concerns. And that's why I don't think we can treat labor standards and their high enforceability as an example and say that, well, we'll follow the same course. We won't, because we don't have the same motivation, the same economic argument here. So as a result, all of these other social sustainability provisions are completely negotiated as best endeavors. And if they are negotiated in binding language, they are left outside, explicitly so, outside the scope of the dispute settlement provision of a mechanism of the agreements. But hold on, there's one exception to it. There's Canada-Israel, this pretty recent trade agreement. They negotiated a whole chapter on trade and gender equality, and they negotiated various provisions as binding. That never happened before. And then at the end of the chapter, they said, this entire chapter is outside the scope. And then at the end, they said, this entire chapter is within the scope of the agreement settlement. And that was a landmark because we had never seen that in gender equality before. But then they made the jurisdiction of the dispute settlement of over that chapter compulsory, but not binding. So what's the point? So bottom line, I think we're in a situation where social sustainable provisions cannot be made enforceable. At least we cannot see that in the near future. And love to hear your views on that.
Yeah, okay, so I have a follow-up question about the rapid response mechanism. Just to say that I agree with Kathleen that this is a one-off thing. This is a provision that responds to a relationship between two neighbor economies in which before under NAFTA, every union knew that if they made wage demands, and every union knew of another union where management would say, we are going to go to Mexico and we have been approached already by a protection union, a union in Mexico. We know that every plant in Mexico legally has to have a union. Well, there are unions that will be very happy to be our union and they won't make any demands on us. They'll make a nice deal. And that is the situation. And that is exactly what unions were furious about, NAFTA was about. So this provision on the rapid response mechanism directly addresses that problem in a way that satisfied the AFL-CIO and brought unions in favor of voting for USMCA. They actively endorsed. And to make that happen, the current presidency, López Obrador's presidency, after firing the negotiators from the earlier president, agreed to this. Okay, they agreed to this because it was the essential grease, the essential political price of getting this agreement through. I don't think the same kind of underlying facts exist with respect to, let's say, runaway plants going to Southeast Asia or elsewhere. So I don't think the predicate exists for replicating this in IPEF, for instance, or some other. And the interesting thing is that it also exists between Canada and Mexico. There has been also a Canada-Mexico rapid response mechanism. Also, all these cases have been on auto parts, almost all. Okay, so why? Well, you have an agreement and then you have enforcement. Enforcement is by nature selective. And USTR has had a great success rate because they've been very picky about the cases they took. They targeted these little countries and Vietnam that are totally dependent on their car parts moving back and forth across the border friction-free, and interrupting that transit by suspending liquidation on parts from that factory puts huge pressure on the company. So the company kind of really, those companies are not in a position to refuse to deal. All those cases get settled, and they get settled fast because they picked targets that are going to fold. The really interesting case is the most recent one that has been complaint brought against Grupo Mexico. I'm interested in your comments about that. So Grupo Mexico is it's the number 2 largest company in Mexico. It owns mines. It owns mines in the United States. It's a multinational. They're anti-union. There's a 15-year strike. Their version is that they settled the strike, and they are operating legally with the substitute union, and that this rapid response mechanism is like a case of my mistaken identity. And they have really been pushing back in the press. So that is a very interesting case where we'll see whether, this is the case where the rubber meets the road. Thank you. Reactions and any words?
Actually, one more.
We're running out of time.
I know you are. Okay. Reciprocity. The U.S. states of Iowa and Arkansas have just basically legalized child labor. Mexico and Canada have now, because of USMCA, passed statutes that ban imports of forced labor goods, I think including child labor. I can't wait until someone in Canada bans imports from Arkansas.
Right, reactions or anything you want to say in conclusion?
Okay, I'll just jump in. Nobody else? No one else? Okay. Thank you for all these comments, great, and questions, and looking forward to continuing here at the coffee break. So I'm just going to pick maybe 2 things to respond to, but that's not meant to say I didn't appreciate the other comments. The first is, I think I'll go to Elisa's and Ben's comments, which came also in connection with Ricardo's about the non-trade agreements, trade, where does a trade agreement, another one of my favorite topics. And so, I think you all said something critically important there, which is sort of, we are in a new space of agreement design, and it may not have the word trade in it, but it's still going to deal with economic things, and then finding that sort of that space where there's something economic and there's something social, whatever that means, right? And finding ways for countries to come together and that are not FTAs, but that are furthering economic interests, I think is where we are. And that is this moment. And it's important to remember all the things the 3 of you said, I think, as governments go forward with that. On the replicability questions, so I think the discussion about rapid response going forward, as I understand it from the governments, and there are government folks in the room, but USTR is out there saying this is the latest and greatest thing and everybody should do it. And everybody else is saying, what are you talking about? Like, we don't have the capacity to do that. Why would we do that? Where would we do that? It's not the same relationship. And but they're still pushing it, not surprisingly, and pushing it in IPEP as well, right? As something that could work in a different sort of design. And so we need to think about what that might look like. The way I hear other governments talking about is if they're going to do something, it's with respect to sort of different labor rights, not collective bargaining. Right? How can we use it to deal with acceptable conditions of work, for example, or other concerns in labor rights? And so I think that conversation will continue about rapid response. Is not totally dead in the water outside of the U.S.-Mexico context. And I probably, Amy, will talk offline with you about the success rate thing. It's very, of course, they're the success rate because they're choosing the ones they know they can claim success on. And that's very wise. Politically, that's what they should do. But it's the ones they're not taking and the ones that can't ever be brought that are where I think we should pay closer attention. And I just want to say, Amrita, I really appreciated your comments, everything you said, and that sort of design and the different ways to think about those really, really useful. I really appreciate you raising that.
Well, unfortunately, we have many more questions than we can take, but I'm sure our participants would be happy to talk more about this with you over the break or during the rest of the conference. In the meantime, please join me in thanking us.